A billionaire CEO's son says to their maid, "Hey miss, I think my dad has a crush on you." Her heart skips a beat at the comment, shocked by what it implies. The rhythmic tapping of keyboard keys echoed from Declan Langford's home office, blending with the faint sound of cartoons playing in the adjacent living room. It was a soundscape of contrasts, the structured, businesslike clicks of a man who commanded boardrooms and the uninhibited giggles of an 8-year-old boy sprawled on the couch. Declan sighed, running a hand through his dark hair as he glanced at his watch. It was nearing 7, and he hadn't moved from his desk since early morning. Another long day filled with investor calls, market reports, and the endless demands of being the CEO of Langford Industries. The door creaked open slightly, and Lucas's face peeked through the gap. His curly hair was a wild mess, and his cheeks were smeared with the remnants of a chocolate chip cookie. "Dad," he announced in that slightly too loud voice kids seem to reserve for interrupting adults. Declan didn't look up. You said we'd build the Lego spaceship tonight." Declan's fingers paused mid-type. Guilt crept into his chest, but before he could reply, a soft voice called from behind Lucas. "Lucas, your dad's working." Sophia Holloway appeared, holding a laundry basket piled high with neatly folded clothes. Her dark hair was tied back in a low bun, and her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. There was an ease in her movements, a quiet efficiency that belied the warmth she radiated. "But he promised," Lucas whined, dragging out the last word for effect. Declan finally looked up, the tired lines around his eyes softening as he met Sophia's gaze. She offered a faint smile. "I'll keep him distracted for a bit," she said gently. "You finish your work." "Thanks, Sophia," Declan muttered, grateful for the reprieve, though guilt lingered. Sophia ushered Lucas back to the living room, balancing the laundry basket on her hip. "All right, mister," she teased. "You've got one more episode of cartoons, and then it's bath time." Lucas flopped dramatically onto the couch, but didn't protest. He adored Sophia, everyone did. As the evening wore on, the chaos of the Langford household ebbed into a calm rhythm. Lucas, freshly bathed and in his dinosaur pajamas, trailed after Sophia into the laundry room. She was folding Declan's crisp button-up shirts with practiced care. Lucas watched her for a moment, his little brows furrowed in thought. "Sophia? She didn't look up, expertly matching a pair of socks. "I think my dad has a crush on you." The socks in her hands froze mid-fold. Sophia blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What did you say?" Lucas's face was as innocent as ever, but his eyes twinkled with mischief. "My dad. He likes you." Sophia let out a startled laugh, setting the socks down. "Lucas, where did you get that idea?" "He looks at you funny," Lucas said matter-of-factly, plopping onto the floor with his favorite stuffed tiger in hand. "Like, not mad funny. Nice funny. Nice funny," she repeated, trying to suppress a smile. "Yeah," Lucas insisted. "And he talks to you more than he talks to anyone else. Except me, maybe. And you make him coffee the way he likes it. That's what people do when they like someone, right?" Sophia's cheeks warmed, though she wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or the sheer absurdity of the conversation. "Lucas," she said, crouching down to his level, "I think your dad just appreciates the help around the house. That's all. But you're so nice," Lucas countered, his voice tinged with genuine conviction. "And you're really pretty. Flattery will get you nowhere," Sophia teased, ruffling his hair. He giggled, the sound light and infectious. "You should marry my dad," he declared, entirely serious now. Sophia let out a louder laugh, standing up and shaking her head. "All right, Mr. Matchmaker. Time for bed." As she tucked Lucas in, her mind lingered on his words. They were the innocent musings of a child, she reminded herself. Still, there was a part of her, a tiny, berry part, that felt a flicker of something she quickly dismissed as foolish. Meanwhile, Declan emerged from his office, loosening his tie as he headed toward the kitchen for a late-night coffee. He caught sight of Sophia coming down the hallway, her face lit by a faintly amused expression. "What's funny?" he asked, pausing. Sophia hesitated for a moment, then decided against sharing Lucas's proclamation. "Your son," she said simply. "Always," Declan replied with a faint smile. "What did he do now?" Sophia shook her head, a mysterious glint in her eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about. He's asleep now." Declan nodded, though he lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks for everything today. I don't know what we'd do without you." Sophia's chest tightened at the earnestness in his voice. "Just doing my job," she said softly, giving him a polite nod before retreating toward the laundry room. Declan watched her go, the quiet click of the door echoing faintly in the otherwise silent house. He found himself standing there for a moment longer than he intended, an unfamiliar warmth spreading in his chest. Later that night, as he sat on the edge of Lucas's bed, Declan brushed a hand over his son's hair. Lucas stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Night, kiddo," Declan murmured, his voice low. In his sleep, Lucas mumbled something Declan couldn't quite catch, though he could have sworn he heard the word Sophia. Declan shook his head, chuckling to himself as he turned off the bedside lamp. As he closed the door behind him, a thought crossed his mind, one he quickly pushed away. Sophia was good for Lucas. She was good for the house. And if he wasn't careful, he might start to believe she was good for him too. The next morning, the house hummed with its usual weekday rhythm. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the kitchen as Sophia moved with practiced ease, preparing breakfast while humming a soft tune. Lucas sat at the table, slurping cereal and chattering away about his school project on space exploration. Declan entered, his tie slightly askew and his phone already in hand. He mumbled a distracted morning and sat down, scrolling through emails. Sophia set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, the exact way he liked it, black, with a splash of hazelnut syrup. Declan looked up, surprised by the gesture, though he didn't say anything. Instead, he muttered a quiet, "Thanks," and took a sip, the warmth cutting through the chill of his usual morning rush. Lucas, oblivious to the quiet exchange, piped up. "Dad, did you know there's a planet made of diamonds?" "Is that so?" Declan replied, still half focused on his phone. "Yeah. And I think Sophia should go there 'cause she's, like, super shiny too." Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's sweet of you, Lucas, but I think Earth is shiny enough for me." Lucas grinned, his spoon clinking against the bowl. "I told her last night you have a crush on her." Declan choked on his coffee. The room went silent except for Lucas's chewing. Declan set his cup down, staring at his son with wide eyes. "You what?" "I told her you like her," Lucas said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Declan's gaze darted to Sophia, who was carefully rearranging a tray of muffins on the counter, her cheeks flushed. "Lucas," Declan began, his voice a mix of sternness and mortification. "You can't just say things like that." "But it's true, right?" Lucas asked innocently, his head tilted. Sophia cleared her throat, stepping in to defuse the situation. "Lucas, why don't you grab your backpack? The bus will be here soon." Lucas groaned but complied, sliding off his chair and trudging toward the hallway. "You guys are so weird," he muttered under his breath. As soon as he was out of earshot, Declan let out a heavy sigh. "I'm so sorry about that. I don't know where he gets these ideas." Sophia turned to face him, a wry smile playing on her lips. "It's fine, really. Kids say all sorts of things. He's just odd imaginative," Declan added, running a hand through his hair. "Clearly," Sophia replied, the humor in her tone lightening the awkwardness. Declan nodded, grateful she wasn't taking it seriously, but as he grabbed his briefcase and left for the day, the exchange lingered in his mind. Throughout the week, Lucas's antics continued to test Declan's patience, and inadvertently made him notice Sophia in ways he hadn't before. One evening, Declan came home to find the living room transformed into an elaborate cardboard space station. Lucas was inside, wearing a tinfoil helmet, while Sophia knelt beside him, helping tape up the command center, with a look of genuine joy on her face. "You're really taking this astronaut thing seriously," Declan remarked, dropping his briefcase by the door. Sophia looked up, her smile bright. Lucas said he needed a co-pilot. Who am I to say no to space exploration? Declan chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. You have more patience than anyone I know. Sophia shrugged, though her eyes softened. He's a great kid. Hard to say no to him. Declan watched as she turned back to Lucas, her laugh ringing out as he made her wear a matching foil helmet. There was something so natural about the way she interacted with his son, as though she'd been part of their lives far longer than the years she'd worked for them. Later that night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Declan lingered in the kitchen where Sophia was tidying up. You're really good with him, you know, he said, leaning against the counter. Sophia glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. Thanks. He makes it easy. Declan hesitated, his gaze drifting to the floor. It's been hard raising him alone, I mean. I'm not sure I always get it right. Sophia paused, her expression softening. No one ever does, Declan. But Lucas adores you. That says a lot. Her words struck something in him, and for a moment, he felt the familiar pang of guilt. Memories of his late wife, Emily, surfaced, her laughter, her unwavering support, and the way she'd held their family together with grace. When she'd passed away suddenly, Declan had thrown himself into his work, convincing himself that success would fill the void. But no achievement, no deal closed, could replace what he'd lost. Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts. You okay? He nodded quickly, masking the vulnerability. Yeah. Just tired. She didn't press further, but her knowing look told him she understood more than he let on. In the weeks that followed, Declan found himself noticing Sophia in ways that caught him off guard. It wasn't just her kindness with Lucas or her efficiency in keeping the household running. It was the quiet strength she carried, the way she approached life with resilience despite her own challenges. One evening, as they sat in the living room discussing Lucas's school schedule, Declan asked casually, You've mentioned your family before. Do they live nearby? Sophia hesitated before replying, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. Not really. My mom's in Arizona. My brother's stationed overseas. It's just me here. You moved here alone? She nodded. Needed the work. Plus, I wanted to save up for college. Had to put it on hold to help my mom after my dad passed. Declan's chest tightened at the mention of her sacrifices. He saw a reflection of his own struggles in her story, though she bore hers with a grace that humbled him. You ever think about going back to school? He asked, genuinely curious. Sometimes, she admitted, her eyes meeting his. But for now, I'm where I need to be. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Declan felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a pull towards someone who understood the weight of loss and the beauty of resilience. But as quickly as it came, he pushed it aside, retreating behind the walls he'd built so carefully. Still, as he watched Sophia return to her work, her presence lingered in his mind. And for the first time in a long while, Declan wondered if those walls were worth keeping up at all. The days following Declan's late-night conversation with Sophia left him oddly contemplative. Her words lingered in his mind, especially the way she spoke about her sacrifices with such quiet resolve. Declan wasn't used to people who didn't expect anything from him. His world was full of transactions, favors with strings attached, kindness laced with ulterior motives. But Sophia's gestures felt genuine. It started with small things, though they didn't feel small in the moment. One evening, as Declan buried himself in yet another late-night work session, Sophia knocked gently on the door of his office. I thought you might need this, she said, stepping inside with a steaming cup of coffee. Declan looked up, startled. Thanks, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Sophia glanced at the mountain of papers on his desk. Have you eaten? He paused. Not really. I'll grab something later. Sophia sighed, shaking her head. You say that every time. Without waiting for his protest, she disappeared and returned a few minutes later with a plate of food. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a sandwich and some fruit, but Declan found himself oddly touched. "You don't have to do this," he said as she set the plate down. "I know," she replied simply. "But someone has to." For a moment, Declan just stared at her, unsure how to respond. Then, with a quiet nod, he picked up the sandwich. The gestures continued, each one chipping away at the walls Declan had spent years constructing. Sophia would casually remind him to take breaks, leave his favorite snacks near his workspace, and encourage him to spend more time with Lucas. "Your son wants to show you his new rocket ship," she mentioned one evening as Declan walked in from work. "I'll check it out later," Declan replied, loosening his tie. Later had become his default answer. Sophia didn't push, but the next morning, he found a hand-drawn picture taped to his office door, a crude rendition of a spaceship with the words, "For Dad," scrawled at the bottom in Lucas's messy handwriting. The guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. That evening, Declan sat cross-legged on the floor of Lucas's room, surrounded by scattered Lego pieces. Sophia passed by the door, pausing when she saw them laughing over an argument about how many engines the spaceship needed. Declan glanced up, catching her eye, and for the first time in a while, he felt like he was getting something right. Lucas, of course, took every opportunity to nudge his dad and Sophia closer together. One Friday evening, Declan came home to find Lucas waiting for him at the door, practically bouncing with excitement. "We're having a movie night!" Declan blinked. "We are?" "Yep." "Sophia said it's your turn to pick the movie." Declan shot a questioning look at Sophia, who stood nearby, folding a blanket. "It was Lucas's idea," she said with a faint smile, though the amused glint in her eyes betrayed her complicity. "All right, but if I'm picking, we're watching Raiders of the Lost Ark," Declan said. "Fine," Lucas said, dragging him toward the couch. The three of them ended up squished together, with Lucas wedged in the middle and a massive bowl of popcorn balanced precariously on his lap. Somewhere between the iconic boulder chase scene and Lucas's running commentary, Declan found himself glancing at Sophia. Her laughter was soft and unguarded, and for a moment, he forgot about the endless responsibilities waiting for him. It became a tradition after that: Friday movie nights, family dinners, and spontaneous outings orchestrated by Lucas's not-so-subtle matchmaking. But it wasn't just Lucas's schemes that brought them closer. Declan found himself genuinely curious about Sophia, drawn to the quiet strength she carried and the stories she occasionally let slip. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, he asked, "Do you ever think about going back to school?" Sophia paused, rinsing a dish before answering. "Sometimes. But life has a way of throwing curveballs." "What did you study?" "Biology," she said, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. "I wanted to work in wildlife conservation." "Why didn't you?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "My dad got sick. Mom couldn't handle the bills alone, so I dropped out to help." Declan leaned against the counter, watching her. "That's a lot to take on." Sophia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You do what you have to for family." The words struck a chord in Declan. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made for his own family, the long hours he'd spent building a legacy that often felt hollow. As the weeks went by, Declan found himself looking forward to the little moments with Sophia. He admired her intelligence, her resilience, and the way she brought warmth and stability to a house that had once felt cold and empty. But there were also moments that caught him off guard, like the way she laughed at Lucas's terrible jokes or the quiet pride in her eyes when she talked about her brother's achievements. One night, as they stood on the back porch watching Lucas chase fireflies, Declan found himself saying, "You're good for him." Sophia glanced at him, surprised. "Lucas?" "Yeah," Declan said, though his gaze lingered on her a moment too long. "And for me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sophia looked away, her cheeks tinged pink. "He's a great kid. Makes it easy." Declan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd said more than he intended. As the evening wore on and the house settled into its usual quiet, Declan found himself sitting alone in his office. He stared at the family photo on his desk, him, Emily, and a much younger Lucas, their smiles frozen in time. Emily's absence was still a void in his life, but for the first time in years, he felt something new beginning to fill that space. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and it had everything to do with the woman who had walked into their lives and unknowingly started to piece their family back together. The days had begun to blur together in a comfortable rhythm. Declan found himself slipping into the small routines Sophia had unknowingly created in their lives. The coffee waiting for him in the morning, the quiet reminders to take breaks, and the warmth she brought to the house that had once felt so stark and cold. But the fragile balance shattered one rainy Saturday afternoon. Declan was upstairs in his office, scanning through reports while the sound of Lucas's laughter drifted up from the living room. Sophia was there, keeping him entertained as usual. She'd promised to help him build a fort, and Lucas had been ecstatic, hauling pillows and blankets to the middle of the room. Declan had just leaned back in his chair when the laughter abruptly stopped. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a sharp cry. Declan bolted from his desk, heart pounding. By the time he reached the living room, Sophia was already kneeling beside Lucas, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the situation. "He fell," she said quickly, looking up at Declan. "He climbed onto the couch to hang the last blanket and slipped." Lucas was clutching his arm, tears streaming down his face. His cheeks were pale, and he whimpered every time he tried to move. "Lucas," Declan said, his voice tight with panic as he knelt beside them. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. You're okay." "It hurts," Lucas choked out, his small frame trembling. "We need to take him to the hospital," Sophia said, her tone steady despite the worry in her eyes. Declan nodded, scooping Lucas into his arms. He felt the weight of his son, so small and fragile, and for the first time in years, the overwhelming fear of being a single parent clawed at him. Sophia grabbed the car keys, and they hurried to the driveway. Declan settled Lucas in the back seat, his arm cradled carefully in a makeshift sling Sophia had fashioned from a scarf. The ride to the hospital was tense and silent, save for Lucas's soft sobs. Declan drove with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw clenched as he stole glances at the rearview mirror. Sophia sat beside Lucas, whispering soothing words and holding his good hand. Once at the hospital, everything became a blur of doctors and nurses. X-rays confirmed that Lucas had fractured his arm, and though the injury wasn't severe, Declan's nerves remained frayed. Hours later, as they sat in Lucas's hospital room waiting for the discharge papers, Declan slumped into the chair beside the bed. Lucas was asleep, his tiny arm now encased in a bright blue cast decorated with cartoon rockets the nurse had drawn. Sophia sat in the chair opposite him, exhaustion etched into her features. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "He's going to be okay," she finally said, her voice soft. Declan nodded, rubbing a hand over his face. I hate seeing him like that. I feel like I failed him." Sophia frowned. "You didn't fail him, Declan. Accidents happen. And you were here when he needed you most." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "It's moments like these that make me realize how much I miss her." Sophia didn't have to ask who he meant. "Emily was always the one who kept things steady," he continued, his voice heavy with grief. "She had this way of making everything seem manageable, no matter how chaotic life got. When she died, I didn't just lose her, I lost a part of me that knew how to be a good dad." Sophia's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his words. She hesitated, then reached across the small space between them to place a hand on his arm. "You're too hard on yourself. Lucas adores you. He doesn't see the mistakes you think you're making. He sees his dad, the person he looks up to most in the world." Declan looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," she admitted. "But love never is." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Declan let out a shaky breath, nodding. "What about you?" he asked after a moment. "You've sacrificed so much for your family. Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" Sophia smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. All the time. I used to dream about working in wildlife conservation, maybe traveling the world and helping endangered species. But life had other plans. Do you regret it? Not regret, she said thoughtfully. Just wonder. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if things had gone differently. But I try not to dwell on it. You can't live in the what-ifs. Declan studied her, struck by the quiet strength in her voice. You're remarkable, you know that? Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm just me, Declan. That's all. But to Declan, she was so much more. When Lucas stirred in his sleep, they both leaned in instinctively, their hands brushing as they adjusted his blanket. The contact sent a jolt through Declan, and he pulled back slightly, his pulse quickening. Sophia glanced at him, her cheeks tinged pink, but she didn't say anything. Later that night, as they drove home with Lucas asleep in the back seat, Declan found himself stealing glances at Sophia. She stared out the window, her expression pensive. When they arrived home, Sophia carried Lucas to his room while Declan followed, watching as she tucked him in with the same care she always showed. As they stood in the hallway afterward, the house quiet around them, Declan hesitated. Sophia, he began, his voice low. She turned to face him, her dark eyes meeting his. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Sophia smiled, her expression soft. You don't have to thank me, Declan. I'm just glad he's okay. But Declan knew it was more than that. It was her presence, her steadiness, and the way she seemed to anchor him when everything felt like it might fall apart. That night, as he lay awake in his bed, Declan couldn't stop thinking about her. And for the first time in years, he didn't just feel the weight of his grief. He felt something else, a flicker of hope. The days after Lucas's accident were quieter, yet something between Declan and Sophia had undeniably shifted. The vulnerability they'd shared in the hospital lingered, threading unspoken understanding into their everyday interactions. Declan began to notice the little things about Sophia even more. The way she hummed softly when she folded laundry, her habit of brushing a strand of hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, and the way her laughter seemed to brighten the entire house. He found himself wanting to give back, though he wasn't quite sure how. One morning, as Sophia was preparing breakfast, Declan approached her with a hesitant smile. I was thinking, he began, holding a mug of coffee he'd actually made himself, a rare occurrence. You've been working nonstop, especially after everything with Lucas. How about you take a day off? Do something just for you. Sophia looked up from the eggs she was scrambling, surprised. A day off? Yeah. Go out, relax, do something you enjoy. I'll manage here. She smiled, though there was a trace of amusement in her expression. You? Managing the house? I can handle it, Declan said with mock defensiveness. How hard can it be? Sophia chuckled, shaking her head. That's kind, Declan, but I'm fine. Besides, I'd probably spend the day worrying about what Lucas is eating or whether you've remembered to switch the laundry. Declan raised a brow. So that's a no? It's a thank you, but no, she replied gently. He sighed but couldn't help smiling at her stubbornness. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Over the next few weeks, he found small ways to show his appreciation. One evening, as Sophia returned from running errands, she found a neatly wrapped package on the kitchen counter. What's this? She asked, glancing at Declan, who was leaning casually against the doorway. Open it and find out. Sophia untied the ribbon and carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing a beautifully illustrated book on wildlife conservation. She ran her fingers over the cover, her expression softening. How did you? Lucas mentioned you used to love biology, Declan said, his voice casual but his gaze intent. I thought you might like it. Sophia's throat tightened. Declan, this is thoughtful. Thank you. It's nothing, he said with a shrug, though the slight flush in his cheeks betrayed his nonchalance. But it wasn't nothing to her. It wasn't just the book, it was the way he noticed, the way he cared. And that scared her. Sophia found herself wrestling with emotions she couldn't quite name. Declan Langford was her employer, a man so far removed from her world that it felt absurd to even entertain the idea of something more. Yet, every time he looked at her with that quiet intensity, she felt her resolve waver. She tried to push the feelings away, focusing instead on her work, but Declan made it increasingly difficult. He started seeking her opinion on things he'd never asked about before. "Do you think this proposal makes sense?" he asked one evening, sliding a document across the kitchen table as she packed Lucas's lunch for the next day. Sophia raised a brow. "You're asking me? Why not? You're smart, and I trust your judgment." Her cheeks flushed as she scanned the page. "Well, this part here," she said, pointing to a section, "might come off a bit aggressive. Maybe reframe it as a collaboration instead of a demand?" Declan studied her thoughtfully. "You're right. That's a good call." Sophia smiled, though the moment left her feeling more conflicted than ever. Declan, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. The closer he got to Sophia, the harder it became to ignore the nagging voice in his head, the one that warned him about the risks. People would talk. His world, full of polished smiles and calculated alliances, wouldn't understand. But then he'd see her laugh with Lucas or catch her tucking a stray hair behind her ear, and the doubts would fade, replaced by an ache he couldn't deny. The tipping point came during a family event, a small gathering Declan reluctantly agreed to attend after weeks of persuasion from his sister, Caroline. "It'll be good for Lucas," Caroline had insisted. "And for you, too." Sophia was there, of course, helping Lucas navigate the buffet table and keeping an eye on him as he ran around with the other kids. As the evening wore on, someone turned on music, and the soft strains of a classic jazz tune filled the air. Declan stood off to the side, nursing a glass of wine, when he noticed Sophia swaying slightly to the rhythm as she stacked empty plates. "Do you dance?" he asked, stepping closer. Sophia looked up, startled. "What? Do you dance?" he repeated, setting his glass down and holding out a hand. She hesitated, glancing around. "I don't think just one dance," he said, his voice low and coaxing. Sophia bit her lip, then set the plates down and slipped her hand into his. Declan led her to the edge of the patio, where the soft glow of string lights created an intimate warmth. He placed a hand gently on her waist, and she rested hers on his shoulder. For a moment, they moved awkwardly, each acutely aware of the other. But as the music flowed, they relaxed, falling into an easy rhythm. "You're good at this," Sophia said softly, her gaze meeting his. "I had a good teacher," Declan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sophia tilted her head. "Emily?" Declan nodded, his expression bittersweet. "She loved dancing. Used to drag me onto the floor at every party, even when I protested." Sophia's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "She must have been amazing." "She was," Declan said, his eyes softening. "But so are you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sophia looked away, her cheeks warming. "Declan?" He shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." Sophia swallowed hard, her emotions a tangled knot. When the song ended, Declan reluctantly let her go, the warmth of her hand lingering in his. That night, as she lay awake in her room, Sophia replayed the moment in her mind. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she found herself daring to hope. And for Declan, the walls he'd spent years building felt closer to crumbling than ever. The days following the family event felt different. There was a new tension between Declan and Sophia, not uncomfortable, but unspoken, charged with emotions neither of them dared to name. They fell back into their routines, but moments of lingering eye contact and fleeting touches hinted at the bond growing stronger between them. Declan found himself more protective of Sophia, making sure she wasn't overworking herself and encouraging her to take breaks. He caught himself smiling more often, especially when she was around. For Sophia, it became harder to ignore how Declan's kindness and attentiveness were stirring feelings she knew she shouldn't entertain. It was Lucas, however, who seemed to notice the change most. He began referring to Sophia as part of the family, a statement that made her heart ache with both joy and unease. But the bubble they were living in didn't last. One afternoon, as Sophia helped Lucas with his homework, the doorbell rang. Declan, who had taken the day off to work from home, opened the door to find his sister Caroline standing there, her expression unreadable. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes darted around, taking in the cozy scene of Sophia and Lucas at the kitchen table. Sophia smiled politely. "Hello, Caroline." Caroline offered a tight smile in return. "Sophia. Always so helpful." Declan frowned at the undertone in her voice. "What's going on, Caroline?" She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing. I've just been hearing some interesting things lately." Sophia stiffened, sensing the shift in the air. "Like what?" Declan pressed. Caroline's gaze landed on Sophia. "Well, some people seem to think there's more going on here than just a professional arrangement. It's one thing to have a maid, Declan, but it's another to let her think she's something more." Sophia's face burned with embarrassment. "Excuse me? I'm just saying," Caroline continued, feigning innocence. "You've worked hard to build a reputation, Declan. People talk. And not everyone has the best intentions." "That's enough," Declan said, his voice sharp. But the damage was done. Sophia stood, her hands trembling as she gathered Lucas's papers. "If you'll excuse me, I think I'll take a walk." Declan reached out to stop her, but she avoided his gaze and hurried out the door. Lucas, who had been quietly listening, glared at Caroline. "Why did you say that?" "Sophia's not bad." Caroline sighed, kneeling to meet his eye level. "Sweetheart, I'm not saying she's bad. I'm just saying your dad needs to be careful. Sometimes people aren't who they seem to be." "That's not true," Lucas snapped, his face red with anger. "You're mean." Declan stepped between them, his jaw tight. "Lucas, go to your room." "But now," Declan said, his tone firm but not unkind. Lucas stomped upstairs, and Declan turned to his sister. "You've crossed the line, Caroline. I won't have you disrespecting Sophia like that." Caroline folded her arms. "I'm just looking out for you. People will see this as unprofessional. You could lose credibility, maybe even clients. Is that really worth it?" Declan stared at her, his expression cold. "You don't know anything about Sophia. And frankly, it's none of your business." Caroline huffed, grabbing her coat. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." As soon as she left, Declan went looking for Sophia. He found her sitting on the back porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared into the distance. "Sophia," he said softly, stepping closer. She didn't turn around. "She's right, you know. I don't belong here." "That's not true." Sophia shook her head, her voice breaking. "It doesn't matter if it's true. People will always think it is. I can't be the reason people talk about you like this." "I won't." Declan crouched beside her, his heart aching at the pain in her voice. "Sophia, I don't care what people say. You're part of this family, I'm not," she interrupted, her eyes finally meeting his. "I'm your employee, Declan. That's all I'll ever be to everyone else." Declan opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He could see the determination in her eyes, the walls she was rebuilding around herself. "I'll finish out the week," she said quietly, standing. "But after that, I think it's best if I go." Declan watched her walk inside, his chest tight with frustration and helplessness. The next few days were a blur of tension and unspoken words. Sophia went about her duties with a practiced smile, but there was a distance in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. Declan tried to talk to her, but she always found a way to deflect or excuse herself. It was Lucas who finally broke the silence. One evening, as Declan sat in his office, trying and failing to focus on work, Lucas burst in, his face streaked with tears. "Why are you letting her leave?" he demanded, his small fists clenched. Declan sighed, rubbing his temples. Lucas, it's complicated. No, it's not, Lucas shouted. You always let work win. You let it take you away from me, and now you're letting it take Sophia away too. Declan froze, his son's words hitting him like a blow. She loves us, Lucas continued, his voice breaking. And you love her too. So why are you letting her go? Declan stared at his son, the truth he'd been avoiding now glaringly obvious. He did love Sophia. He'd been so afraid of what others might think, of the risk involved, that he hadn't realized how much he stood to lose by doing nothing. Without a word, Declan stood and left the room, Lucas's tear-filled gaze following him. He had to fix this before it was too late. Declan spent the night replaying Lucas's words in his head. His son's tear-streaked face and raw honesty struck a nerve he couldn't ignore. Lucas was right. Declan had been letting fear control his life, fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability, fear of change. But what was the point of all his success if he couldn't fight for the people who truly mattered? The next morning, Declan arrived at his office with an uncharacteristic determination. He had a board meeting scheduled, and while he usually approached these gatherings with cold precision, today was different. As the executives filed into the sleek conference room, murmurs of greetings and idle chatter filled the air. Declan sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as the meeting began. Midway through a presentation on quarterly projections, Declan raised his hand, signaling for silence. I need to address something personal, he said, his voice steady but firm. The room fell silent, curious eyes turning toward him. There have been rumors circulating about me and someone who works in my home. Her name is Sophia Holloway, and she has been a part of my family's life for over a year. The murmurs began immediately, but Declan silenced them with a sharp glance. Sophia is not just an employee, he continued, his voice rising with conviction. She is someone who has shown extraordinary kindness, integrity, and resilience. She has been there for my son when I couldn't be, and she has brought light to our lives in ways I didn't think possible. A few board members exchanged uncomfortable looks, but Declan pressed on. Let me be clear, I value her deeply. If anyone here thinks less of me because I care about someone like Sophia, then you're welcome to reconsider your position in this company. But I will not allow judgment or gossip to dictate my life any longer. The room was silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Declan let the weight of his words settle before concluding. Now, if there are no objections, let's move on. The meeting continued, though the air felt different. Declan didn't care. He'd said what needed to be said, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity. That evening, when Declan returned home, he found Sophia in the kitchen, methodically wiping down the counters. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. Can we talk? Declan asked, his tone gentle. Sophia hesitated, then nodded. Of course. I need to say this before you leave, he began, leaning against the counter. I've spent so much of my life trying to control how people see me. But in doing that, I've been blind to what really matters. And what matters is you. Sophia blinked, her hand tightening on the cloth she held. You've made me a better father, a better man, Declan continued. And I can't let you walk out of our lives without telling you how much you mean to me. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but Declan held up a hand. Before you say anything, just wait. He pulled his phone from his pocket and called Lucas downstairs. The boy came running, his face lighting up when he saw Sophia. Sophia, Declan said, kneeling beside his son. Lucas and I both need you in our lives. Not as an employee, but as family. Lucas's eyes widened, his gaze darting between his dad and Sophia. Declan stood, his voice softening. I know this is a lot, and I've made mistakes. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that this isn't about what anyone else thinks. It's about us, me, you, and Lucas. Sophia looked between the two of them, her heart pounding. Declan, I know it won't be easy, he said, stepping closer. But I'm ready to fight for us if you'll let me. Tears filled Sophia's eyes as she struggled to process his words. For so long, She'd convinced herself that this was impossible, that their worlds were too far apart. But the sincerity in Declan's voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, broke through her defenses. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "The scrutiny, the pressure. It's not just about us." Declan nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. But I promise you, Sophia, I will always put you and Lucas first. No matter what it takes." Lucas tugged on her sleeve, his voice small but insistent. "Please don't go, Sophia. We need you." Her gaze softened as she looked at the boy she'd grown to love like her own. Then she turned back to Declan, seeing not the powerful CEO, but the man who had bared his soul to her. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But only if we take this one step at a time." Declan exhaled, relief washing over him. "One step at a time," he agreed. Lucas let out a cheer, wrapping his arms around Sophia's waist. She laughed through her tears, hugging him tightly. As Declan watched them, a sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, with the people who mattered most. And he vowed never to let fear hold him back again. The days after Sophia decided to stay were marked by a quiet but profound shift. She and Declan didn't rush into anything, true to their promise to take things one step at a time. They continued their routines, breakfasts together, movie nights with Lucas, but now, there was a softness, an unspoken understanding, that hadn't been there before. Lucas, of course, picked up on the changes immediately. He was ecstatic, shamelessly acting as their biggest supporter and occasional matchmaker. One evening, as Declan helped Lucas finish his homework, the boy blurted out, "We should have a family day." Declan raised a brow. "A family day?" "Yeah," Lucas said, eyes wide with excitement. "You, me, and Sophia. We could go to the zoo or a park or something. Just us." Sophia, who had been folding laundry nearby, glanced up, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Declan pretended to consider it, tapping his chin. "I don't know. Sophia might be too busy." Lucas immediately turned to her, his hands clasped in a pleading gesture. "Please, Sophia. It'll be so much fun." She laughed, shaking her head. "How could I say no to that face?" Lucas whooped, running off to start planning the outing, leaving Declan and Sophia alone. "You know he's scheming again," Declan said, leaning against the table. Sophia chuckled. "I think he gets it from you." "Fair enough," Declan admitted, his gaze lingering on her. "Thank you. For everything. For staying." Sophia met his eyes, warmth spreading through her chest. "I think we're all where we're supposed to be." The following weekend, they set out for the zoo, Lucas's choice. The day was perfect, filled with laughter, playful banter, and moments that felt almost too good to be true. Declan carried Lucas on his shoulders for most of the afternoon, while Sophia snapped pictures, capturing the candid joy that radiated from both father and son. At one point, as they watched the giraffes, Lucas grabbed Sophia's hand and tugged her closer to Declan. "You guys should hold hands," he declared loudly. Sophia's cheeks flushed, and Declan let out a low laugh. "Subtle, isn't he?" "Well?" Lucas insisted, looking between them expectantly. Declan glanced at Sophia, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "I guess we'd better do what he says." Sophia rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress her smile as Declan's hand slid into hers. The warmth of his touch was steady, reassuring. For the first time, it felt like they weren't just pretending to be a family, they were one. In the weeks that followed, Declan worked to strike a balance between his demanding career and the life he wanted to build with Sophia and Lucas. He set firmer boundaries at work, delegating tasks and carving out more time for his family. Sophia, encouraged by Declan's unwavering support, decided to pursue her dream of finishing her degree. It wasn't an easy decision, juggling work, classes, and her evolving relationship with Declan, but she knew it was the right one. "You can do this," Declan told her one evening as they sat on the couch, Lucas asleep upstairs. "You've sacrificed so much for everyone else. It's time to do something for yourself." Sophia looked at him, her heart full. I couldn't do it without you. You won't have to, Declan promised. True to his word, he made sure she had everything she needed to succeed, from helping with Lucas to surprising her with a laptop and books for her classes. Sophia often teased him for overdoing it, but deep down, she was grateful for his support. Their life wasn't perfect, there were challenges, moments of doubt, and the occasional disagreement, but they faced them together. Each hurdle only strengthened their bond, reminding them of what they had fought to build. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Lucas announced that he had a surprise. What kind of surprise? Declan asked, eyeing his son suspiciously. You'll see, Lucas said, grinning as he disappeared into the other room. A few minutes later he returned, holding a handmade card. He handed it to Sophia, who opened it to reveal a drawing of the three of them, with the words, Our Family, written in big, colorful letters. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Lucas, who was watching her with an eager expression. Do you like it? I love it, she said, pulling him into a hug. Declan leaned over, his hand resting lightly on her back as he looked at the card. He's got a knack for art, he said softly, his voice laced with pride. That's because I have the best family ever, Lucas declared, his tone matter-of-fact. Declan and Sophia exchanged a glance, their hearts full as they took in the moment. Later that night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Declan reached for Sophia's hand. I never thought I'd have this again, he admitted, his voice quiet. A family. A chance to be happy. Sophia squeezed his hand, leaning her head against his shoulder. Me either. But I'm glad we found each other. The sound of Lucas's laughter drifted from his bedroom window, and for the first time in years, the house felt like a true home. As they sat there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's presence, Declan knew that this was just the beginning of their story, a new chapter filled with love, hope, and the promise of everything they'd built together. Months had passed, and life in the Langford household had settled into a comfortable, joyful rhythm. Sophia was thriving in her classes, balancing her studies and work with a determination that left Declan in awe. Lucas was as mischievous and bright as ever, constantly pulling Sophia and Declan into his world of adventures. And Declan? He had never been happier. But something had been on his mind lately, something he couldn't shake. It wasn't enough to just live in this happiness, he wanted to solidify it, to make it official. To make Sophia his partner in every sense of the word. The idea of proposing wasn't one Declan took lightly. He planned mergers and acquisitions worth billions with less trepidation than he felt now. But the thought of Sophia, her smile, the way she lit up his life and Lucas's, gave him the courage he needed. The proposal had to be perfect, not grand or flashy, but deeply meaningful, something that reflected the quiet beauty of their relationship. He enlisted Lucas's help, who, upon hearing the plan, declared himself head of the proposal department. They decided to propose at home, where their journey together had truly taken root. Declan wanted it to be intimate, surrounded by the life they built. One crisp evening, Declan called Sophia into the living room after dinner. The lights were dimmed, and Lucas sat on the couch, bouncing slightly with excitement. What's going on? Sophia asked, her gaze shifting between them. Just a little surprise, Declan said, smiling as he guided her to the center of the room. A soft melody began to play from the speakers, a song they danced to months ago at the family event, one that held a special place in both their hearts. Sophia tilted her head, confused but intrigued. Declan? He glanced at Lucas, who gave him an exaggerated thumbs up. Taking a deep breath, Declan turned back to Sophia and took her hands in his. Sophia, these past months, this past year, have been the most meaningful of my life. He began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. You came into our world and turned it upside down in the best way possible. You've given me and Lucas something we didn't think we'd have again, a family. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her lips parting in surprise as he dropped to one knee. From his pocket, Declan pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. Sophia Holloway, he said, his voice steady but soft. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me, to us? Sophia stared at him, her hand covering her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. For a moment she was speechless, overwhelmed by the love and sincerity in his eyes. Lucas couldn't hold back any longer. Say yes, Sophia, he blurted, practically bouncing off the couch. We need you. Sophia laughed through her tears, her heart overflowing. She reached out, cupping Declan's face with both hands. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, Declan. I'll marry you. The room erupted into cheers, mostly from Lucas, who immediately launched himself at Sophia and Declan in a giant hug. Declan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands steady despite the emotions coursing through him. You're stuck with us now, Declan teased, his voice thick with affection. I wouldn't want it any other way, Sophia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the evening was a blur of celebration. Lucas declared it the best day ever, and Sophia couldn't stop admiring the ring, though she insisted it wasn't the ring that mattered, it was the love behind it. As the night wound down, the three of them curled up on the couch, the glow of the fireplace casting warm shadows on their faces. Lucas fell asleep first, his head resting on Sophia's lap. Declan reached over, taking her hand in his. We're really doing this, he murmured, his voice full of wonder. Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder, her smile soft and content. We are. In that moment, with Lucas's soft breathing filling the room and Sophia by his side, Declan knew he had everything he'd ever wanted. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that happiness like this could last forever. The day of the wedding arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, with the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the trees. The ceremony was held in the backyard of the Langford home, a place that held so much of their history. It was intimate, surrounded by close friends, family, and the memories they'd built together. Sophia stood at the top of the aisle, her heart pounding as she clutched a bouquet of soft white roses. She wore a simple yet elegant lace gown that hugged her figure, her hair swept up with a few loose strands framing her face. Lucas, dressed in a tiny tuxedo, stood proudly beside her, his job as official ring bearer filling him with purpose. You ready? Lucas whispered, grinning up at her. Sophia laughed softly, her nerves easing at his excitement. I am if you are. Let's do this, he said, grabbing her free hand and leading her down the aisle. Declan stood at the end, waiting for her beneath an arch adorned with white and green blossoms. He wore a charcoal suit, but it was the way he looked at her, with awe, love, and a hint of disbelief, that made her breath catch. When she reached him, Lucas squeezed her hand one last time before stepping aside. Declan reached out, his hands steady as they took hers. You look incredible, he whispered, his voice low and full of emotion. And you look nervous, she teased, her smile soft. Only because I don't know how I got this lucky, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, and filled with laughter. The officiant spoke about love, resilience, and the beauty of second chances. Declan and Sophia exchanged vows they'd written themselves, each word filled with sincerity and a promise of forever. I promise to protect your heart, Declan said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. To make you laugh, to be your partner in every way, and to love you and Lucas with everything I have. Sophia's voice trembled as she spoke. I promise to stand by you, to share in your joys and challenges, and to love you and Lucas with all my heart, every single day. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Lucas was the first to cheer, his voice echoing through the yard. Declan pulled Sophia into a gentle yet firm kiss, the world around them fading into a blur of warmth and happiness. The reception that followed was lively and intimate, with twinkling lights strung across the yard and a small dance floor set up beneath the stars. Lucas gave a speech that brought both laughter and tears, declaring proudly that, We're officially a team now. As Declan and Sophia swayed to their first dance, surrounded by the people who mattered most, they felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the promise of a bright future. Sophia leaned into Declan's chest, her hand in his, and smiled. "We did it," she murmured. Declan kissed the top of her head, his voice soft. "No, we're just getting started." As the sun sets on this heartwarming story, Declan, Sophia, and Lucas stand together, their smiles radiating warmth and love. Their journey wasn't easy, it was full of challenges, heartbreak, and moments of doubt, but they found their way to each other through resilience, trust, and the unshakable belief that love is worth fighting for. This story reminds us that family isn't just about blood, it's about the connections we choose to nurture, the people who show up for us, and the courage to embrace second chances. Whether it's through small gestures, shared vulnerabilities, or grand declarations, love has the power to heal, transform, and bring us home. If this story warmed your heart, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more uplifting tales like this one. And let us know in the comments, what's your favorite story of love and second chances? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.